Okay, ladies and gents, we've still got a few people coming in. We're just a couple of minutes past 11 o'clock, but we'll kick off now with today's presentations for Auckland Beekeepers Club and our monthly meeting. Just a couple of quick items here. This will be, at this stage, we expect the last meeting by webinar. Now that we're down to level 1, we'd already organised today's events and so forth before level 1 was announced. So we carry on with that one, particularly also that we have a guest from outside Auckland. And next month, though, we expect to return to normal in-person meetings at the apiary and so forth. So that will be second Saturday of July, which is the 11th, and that 11th of July meeting will also be our annual general meeting. So I would urge all people, if they can, to come along, make choices about your committee, hear the reports and so forth for the past year and plans for the next year and so forth. So today we have 3 excellent speakers. Starting up first will be Carol Downer, talking about hive records and their value and different ways in which you can keep records on your hive. Then we'll be joined by Dr. Mark Goodwin, who will be talking about the life cycle of Varroa and its obviously critical importance and increasingly so. And then following up will be Kneijber, who will be talking about hive diseases and how to keep your hive disease free. So I'd like to invite Carol, if I could, and then there'll be a Q&A at the end. So we'll be asking some poll questions in the same way that we did last month, which will pop up on your screen during the webinar, and we'll take some of the results from those and actually feed them in both to the individual talks and to the Q&A session at the end. And also, by all means, please have some questions for the Q&A, things that you particularly like the panelists, Carol, Kim and Mark Goodwin, to answer for you. So I'll hand right over to Carol, if I could, to start with hive records. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, hive records, there are so many different ways that people, when they're beekeeping, record what's going on. Commercial beekeepers may have rocks on the top of a hive facing a particular way, but I'm really wanting to concentrate on how to use them and improve your beekeeping. Next slide, please, Dave. Right, so basically, and I mean, Kim's covered this in the last 2 webinars, what we can learn from the past, what happened last year, what worked and didn't work, we can get that from our hive records. Present, what do I need to do now? And what do I want the future to look like? So basically planning where you want to go to from where you are now, and future, anticipate your next apiary visit and prepare for it. Dave? So this is the hive record that I use. And what I'm going to do is explain how I use it and different parts of it and how you can actually personalize them. I mean, the things that I'm interested in may be not the things that you're interested in. They can be very simple, like you may want to record notes when you're at the apiary just to jot down quite quickly. However, I find the more information I have, the more I can actually learn. Next slide, please. Right, so to personalise your records to suit your own needs, your own beekeeping needs. So the basics. You've got annual tasks, you've got biannual tasks. The colony, what's it made up of? You need to know that at all different times of the year. What's the health like, and the hiveware, how is that and what do you need to do with it? Next slide. So basically, when we look at the annual tasks and biannuals, I've got a small part in my records that for AFB checks. So AFB, spring and autumn, and the date that I've actually done that check. The other thing might be the treatment efficacy. You know, how well have I actually, could we go back a slide, please? Oh, okay, forward, sorry. The you know, efficacy of your treatment, mite counts, and the dates you've done the mite counts, because you might be wanting to follow up and keep a record of that, just to see when the mites have gone up, what you've done, date of replacement treatment, whether it be staples, wafers, alternative strips, or ongoing oxalic vaporization. So whatever kind of treatment you're going to use, you need to sort of sort that out into your records so that you can be quite clear about when you have treated. AFB, I always make sure that I check ApiWeb to see if there's been any AFB in my area. Red shows that there has been AFB within 2K of my site, so therefore I'm going to probably do a lot more than I always do a lot more than just the 2 checks a year for AFB. However, that just means that I need to be a little bit more careful, and if I notice that my bees have been robbing or anything like that, then that could be a sign that I need to check even more. Next slide. So the colony, the queen, when and how. The date the colony was requeened, whether it actually swarmed, so it was a natural requeening, whether you used a queen cell, the queen supply you got your bee from, if you actually bought a queen, or whether you used a virgin queen. And it's great to note how well any of those have worked. Other beekeepers that have also used those, or virgin queen or something like that, they may be able to give you some really good feedback on how well it's worked. And you'll learn if look, everything that goes wrong or that doesn't work is as an opportunity to learn. The other thing is the date that the new queen was checked, observations, her size, colouring and condition, and if she's marked what colour. Next slide. With the queen, you want to check the quality of the laying pattern, and I always have notes in my hive around that and my records about that. Physical and condition and appearance, and the temperament of the bees. If you're going to be changing the queen, it's going to be around about 6 weeks until you actually see, or 4 to 5 weeks before you actually start to see a change in temperament, up to 6 weeks. So if your queen you've got is not particularly of a good temperament, that's something else you might want to note. Experience, are the pleasures of are the bees a pleasure to work with? I have a note on my records that say hot or calm. Are they quiet on the comb? Do they settle quickly after inspection? Next. So you'll see I've got circled here the queen, queen sighted. Up the top part there where the other arrow is, I've got the date, the queen supply, and is she marked? You'll also see the AFB check on the other side of that, autumn, spring, treatment, dates in, dates out. So I always like to check on whether she's actually there or not. And obviously next to that, I've got eggs and larvae if we don't see her. Next slide. Cells, when are they ready to cap? So this is another thing I also have on my hive record. If I go into a hive and let's just say the hive swarmed and I see that the queen cell is nearly capped, then I put a ring around that date and I can actually work out by going down my numbering on the days approximately when that queen is due to hatch. So that's a really handy tool if you're actually even if you're putting in a cell and you put it in at so many days, maybe it's at 12 days that you put the cell in, then you can actually look at what time you might be wanting to go back in and check that queen. Next. And here you'll see down the side of the hive record sheet where I've got those dates. So it's just something on the side. It's quite simple and easy. Probably maybe only gets used a couple of times a year. However, it's a great tool. Next. The colony. So as I said before with the colony, I like to make notes on what's going on. So this is also in my records. Population, high, medium or low. And when you're actually recording your records, you may not want to use my wording. You may want to, you may have a different way of describing things. However that works to you, just make sure that it's consistent. And also it's according to the season. So in this time of year, I might say something's got a high population according to the season. So it may not be, they may not be right on the outer frames, but it's still a good population for the time of year. Queen is sighted. Is it the same queen? And as I said before, I've got eggs and larvae. I always note whether there's eggs and larvae in there. The other one I've got down here is drones. So basically, as soon as you start seeing drones in the hive, you then know that the hive is looking, or that it can reproduce, because that's a sign once the drones are there. So I always mark that into the records as soon as I see hives coming into spring. Temperament, hot or calm. And extra notes if it's hot, like it could be the time of the day, it could be the weather conditions, and then I'll check it again, like if they've been really hot and it was a bit overcast, or it was the weather conditions weren't that great, it was a bit windy, then next time I add on to that note just to make sure they haven't just been hot for that particular time. And basically I don't use smoke unless I need to. So I have 3 hives at the moment which I use smoke on. The rest of them, because I've kept a note of their temperament, I know that I actually don't need to smoke them. Then I've got another part which says queen cells, position on frame. Top, mid-frame or bottom. This will give me an idea of possibly if it's a supersedure cell or if something else is going on in the hive. So I mark that off every time because it's a handy tool for me to use. Stores, honey and nectar, very good, okay or poor, and the same for pollen. And that'll give us an idea of how easy it's going to be for the bees to build up, and also for them to go into winter. Next slide. So this is the area where I've got those particular bits of information: hive population, eggs, larvae, queen sighted, drones, hot, calm, etc. Next slide, please. I've also got a section here for notes. If anything else I need to add in, there's a section for notes to add in. Next slide, please. Notes, a few things you might observe in the hive. Signs of viruses, example, twisted wing, tiny little wax moth, maybe when you move a frame, moldy pollen, damp, condensation, wet sides or matte. So when you observe these things in the hive, just if you make a note of them, it'll help. And I also, I look at the health and the condition of the worker bees. Quite often it'll give me an idea if anything else is happening there that I need to attend to, possibly treatment or new frames, etc. Next slide. A few things you might observe outside the hive: excrement on the front of the hive. So if you've got any of these things happening, you need to note them and start to look at what might need to happen about them. You've got dead bees in front of the hive. Is it chilling or robbing? Lots of bees coming and going. Is it robbing? Nectar flow, lots of pollen coming in. And learn how to tell the difference between what robbing looks like and what a nectar flow looks like. Then you've got an idea of when you have a nectar flow, and you can start to record that kind of information and time of when that's happening. Next slide. Notes for the next visit or future planning: swap out old frames. So every year we want to try and swap out at least 4 of our old frames. So how are you going to do that? For instance, I've got one hive at the moment that I know I didn't swap out frames in last year. So, I mean, I know that has to be done. It's on my notes. Swarming. If you're bees have swarmed, when did it happen, and what, how could it have been different? What could you have done differently? Space. Are more frames needed? Are they going to be drawn frames, or are they frames to be drawn? If it's in spring, you might want to be putting in frames to be drawn just to give the bees a bit more work to do and a bit of space if you're not going to be requeening at that stage. Are you going to be using a queen excluder? Do you need an entrance reducer, a feeder or replacement equipment? Next, please, Dave. Observe what the hives have got a propensity to collect. I've also got another, that area where I talk about pollen and nectar and what's available. So basically, some hives will have a propensity to collect a lot of wax, so you may actually use them for drawing frames. You may want to collect pollen or propolis if they collect a lot of it. So it could be a good way to actually sort out whether you want to get more frames drawn or collect some propolis or pollen. Next. What's flowering? What are the bees collecting from the date of flowering, start, finish, pollen and nectar? This may only be of interest, in town, that we can't always tell what our bees are collecting from, but we can see if there are a lot of bees on a plant and look at when it's flowering, because that'll give us a bit of an indicator of what food we're going to have available. And honey flows, how long, and the weather conditions. I think every November we go through a stage of either the weather's fabulous or it's not, and it can be quite tricky. So look at your honey flows and look at how they're actually working. Next. Okay, so basically for beginners, when you're needing help, accurate recording of the past visits and conditions in the hive plus what's going on now is really helpful. I think when people ring up and ask for advice, I think it's really important that you can actually tell them really clearly when, how and why, so that they can possibly look at, and through their experience and through what they know, they can possibly give you help. But we do actually need a good, accurate recording of what's going on in our side of the hive. So that's it from me, and best of luck with your hive records, but set them up to work for you. Don't make them onerous. Mine's quite big. However, do what works for you, but just make sure you keep them. Thank you.
It's excellent. Thanks, Carol. Yep, hive records very important. Mark, can I ask you to come in now and pick up on the life cycle of the Varroa, please? That's great.
Yes. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Hamilton and Ruakura. This is my office, which is just full of books everywhere. Dave sent me a list of questions, which I've just displaced for a second. and I thought it'd be a good idea to go through those, and hopefully they were questions that perhaps lots of people had. So I thought the first question was the life cycle of Varroa. So Varroa, of course, carried around on adult bees. To reproduce, they climb into a cell, and they do that just when it's got a larvae in it, but just before it's capped. And what they do is they climb down the cell and hide in the larval food in the bottom. And we assume they're doing that so the worker bee can't detect that they're there and remove them. And then they're capped over with the larvae, and the larvae puputes to form a pupae and then an adult bee. Once it starts to pupate, the Varroa come up and start to feed on the pupa, and the Varroa starts to lay eggs. And the first eggs produced is always a male, and every other one is a female, and there's usually about 7 to 8 female eggs. And when they hatch, the male mates with all the females, of course. So if it's kind of inbreeding, but quite often in a badly infected colony, there might be 2 Varroa in that larval food, so you get a bit of outcrossing there as well. As far as species of Varroa, and this is always a bit tricky because molecular biologists have got into the species argument, and what isn't a species has changed. But what we work on is there's really 2 basic species, and this is Varroa destructor, the one we have here, and Varroa jacobsoni, which is what we used to call all Varroa present in the world. And both of them evolved on a different species of honeybee, Apis cerana, and this is the Asian honeybee. And they can live quite happily because in the Asian honeybee, the worker cap period is too short for Varroa to reproduce in the cells. So they can only produce in drone cells that have a much larger, longer capped period. And you can't kill a colony by killing males. You've got to kill the females. So they've probably been together millions of years quite nicely. But of course, Varroa destructor jumps species into Apis mellifera, where it can reproduce in the worker cells because they stay capped for just a little bit longer. They also, of course, reproduce in the male cells, but Varroa is just hanging on to Apis mellifera, our bees, by its fingernails because it produces 7 to 8 females, but only 1 to 2 are actually ever old enough to survive when the cell's uncapped. All the rest die. So if our cap period was just another day shorter, then Varroa would probably disappear. It couldn't breed on workers here as well. Another question, and I guess the big one around Varroa, is viruses. Dave asked me how many viruses are found in hives in New Zealand, and I always thought it was 13, but I did a count up and I could only find 11, so I'm not sure where the other 2 have gone to. As far as viruses, I won't go down the list because there's all sorts of weird names like chronic paralysis virus associate, so they're not particularly informative at least. But there are some that when you look in a hive, you may actually come in contact with and see. The first one is deformed wing virus. And that came into New Zealand as best we can work out in 2006. Unfortunately, MPI gave somebody permission to bring in semen to New Zealand where they shouldn't have. And as far as we can tell, the virus came in with the semen. And what you see bees in your hives with shriveled up wings. Now, we always used to get a few of those because it's wax moth damage. So if wax moth chews through a comb and there's a developing bee in it, it'll sometimes have shriveled wings. But if you see a lot of it, it's Varroa, and it's usually a sign that your colony is going to die sometime soon. There's 1 or 2, you can get away with it. But if there's 50 or 60, that's a real sign that there's problems going to happen. Another one, of course, you'll see is sackbrood virus. And that feeds on, it infects developing larvae and has classic symptoms. You sometimes see a perforated capping like AFB. If you remove it and it's got a pair of tweezers, you can take the whole larvae out and you see this fluid-filled sac on it. And that's typical virus, these fluid-filled sacs. And if you stir it up with a matchstick, it's very watery. Now you do see the odd other virus. You'll see a bee out the front that's looking sick and looking very black. But with most of these viruses, there's not been a problem for bees because there's no good way, there hadn't been a good way for a virus to get from one bee to another. Sometimes a bee might lose a few hairs and a virus might got in. So they were all present, but not a major problem, with the exception probably of sackbrood. But Varroa, of course, is the vector and it spreads viruses, and particularly Kashmir bee virus, acute paralysis virus, and deformed wing virus. So that these viruses that were really not an issue, thanks to Varroa, are now a major problem. So Varroa never kills a colony. It's the viruses that Varroa spread that kill the colonies. Next question was, how long does it take Varroa to kill a colony? Well, that's a real tricky one, actually, because it depends on how many you start with. You start with 1, it's probably a couple of years. If you're starting with 5,000, it's probably a couple of weeks. So there's no real answer to that one. But unlike other diseases, typically Varroa, you don't see signs of it in the brood and the bees until things are going very, very wrong. You can find really nice colonies and you think they're really great. You come back 3 weeks later and they're dying on you. So you can get sucked into a false sense of security with Varroa. And that's why we always recommend sampling, doing a sugar shake or something to find out how many Varroa that you do have. So signs of Varroa in a hive, well, your colony dying is a good one. But if you're not sampling, it is really hard. And when Varroa was first found in Auckland, when we did the survey looking to see how far it spread, And these are hobby hives and commercial hives. There were a lot of dead hives that are already dead. There were a whole lot of colonies that were already dying and nobody had noticed. It had all gone unnoticed because, as I say, the colonies look fine until it's too late. The question of viruses and whether you can heal them in a colony, not really. The one thing about the viruses, they don't survive very well outside of honeybees. So if you get on comb, their survival is a very short period of time. So there's nothing special you need to do other than removing the vector. If you can remove the varroa, the viruses usually disappear unless you're doing it too late. Now, a very long question. Was there any research going on now that somebody has pointed out that varroa feed on the on the fat bodies of bees when the varroa is feeding on adult bees? I probably dodged that one, but there are a couple of projects around the world that have been particularly of interest. And one of them was an Israeli group, and we were doing it at Plant and Food as well until we ran into their patent. And what that was using pieces of RNA. And what you can do is you can feed pieces of RNA to anybody, any animal, and you can switch on and off genes. And if you can switch off the wrong genes, you can actually kill your organism. So the thought was that if we could switch off enough genes in Varroa, we could kill it. It looked really promising, and in the future, I'm guessing we'll see something like that exactly. And the great thing about RNAi is it's absolutely specific. So you could actually design an RNA product that would kill, if you like, rats, but you could be so specific, you would only ever kill one rat and nothing else because they are so specific. The other thing is, you may have noticed at Plant and Food, just as I was finishing, we got money from Australia to look at marker-assisted selection of queens that were resistant to Varroa. I mean, it seems like 100 years ago, we had a breeding program to select colonies that were resistant to Varroa. We could do that, but to maintain it cost huge amounts of money. But science has moved on hugely. And what we were thinking is there might be some markers that would tell you which queens were resistant and which ones weren't. So we looked around the world, and there was one marker that had been suggested in laboratory trials might possibly just have some effect on Varroa. So James Sainsbury did a trial where he had queens that didn't have the markers and those that did, and it's easy to test. All you need to send is a wing clipping to a lab and it will tell you it's got the marker. And we really weren't thinking it was going to have any effect. We thought we'd start there and hopefully somebody else would publish new markers. And if we had 4 or 5 markers, we might get resistance. But the colonies we fed had the markers, had significantly less Varroa than the ones we didn't, 30% less Varroa. And we haven't controlled the matings. So a lot of her offspring, some of them would have had the mating, some of the workers would have had the markers and some wouldn't. And we also didn't stop drift. So Varroa were drifting to the colony all the time. But it's a really, really good way forward. And James, I think, published in New Zealand Beekeeper that information. And what you can do is send a wing clipping. You want to do it after the queen's mated, because if you clip the wings beforehand, mating's going to be a problem, of course, to a lab, and they'll tell you whether there's 1 copy of the marker or 2. So that's a really great step forward as well, that we're going to see for Varroa control. I just noticed that I'm not sure how much attention everybody made to James's discovery there, and it's being published, but the world will take notice of it, because you don't have to keep adding markers till you get from a 30% reduction to 100%. You only have to get 30, perhaps 40 or 50 before Varroa falls over and there's none in the colony at least. So that's I guess all the Varroa questions. Just probably timely for to mention, myself and one of my old research associates at Plant and Food have written a couple of books, which I think you might find of interest, one for commercial beekeepers and one for hobbyists. And what we've done is we've taken every beekeeping subject, and it might be like feeding sugar syrup, and we've put everything in different categories. One of them is things that you must do, which if you don't do, your colony will die or it's illegal. Things you should do, which is our recommendation. things you could do, which we see lots of beekeepers doing, commercial and hobbyist beekeepers doing. We don't think there's any benefit at all, but there's probably no harm in it either, other than the cost and energy people are taking to do it. Things you shouldn't do, of course, and things you mustn't do. And Ecritech, who's commissioned the books, will be making those available sometime soon, plus a series of, I think it's about 100 videos they're aiming for, each about 3 minutes on beekeeping. So I'll probably stop there, I think. I've no idea how long I took, but as nobody told me how much time I could have, I'm not feeling guilty about it.
No, that's absolutely perfect. That was an excellent length and good questions and good topics. Thanks very much indeed. And I'll be very interested in those books coming out. As you say, the idea of must do, should do, could do, must not, and so forth through there, I think is going to be assistance to a lot of people. Yeah, particularly those starting out, but also those of us who have been around for a couple of years. So if you mute yourself again, Mark, and then until we get on to the Q&A session, and Kim, if you unmute, and you could take off on your one on preventing disease in the hive, please, Kim.
Hi. So I introduce myself. I'm in a strange man's house, thanks to Dave. I've learned his name. His name is Scott. So I don't have any reception at home. So it was going to be a library or some public place. But yeah, Scott, a neighbour in my area, has kindly let me use his tablet, and I'm not sure on technology. Anyway, apart from all that, I'm here and I'm going to do a presentation on how to keep hives disease-free. So let's see how it works. All right, Dave? Can you bring up the PowerPoint? Hopefully. Okay, so this was a topic given to me, and I had to think about it, how to keep the hives disease-free. So disease, I really wanted to concentrate just on that subject. There's lots of management we need to put in place to keep our bees healthy, etc. like that, and that's from a lot of different threats we face. So Dave, let's move on to the next slide. And we have to rely on Dave to do this for us. Isn't he amazing? Because yeah, again, technology doesn't always work for us. So our honeybee, just like any other animal, honeybees are susceptible to pests and diseases and non-infectious disorders. So just like us, they can get colds, they can get diarrhea, you know, and they have threats just like we do, you know, the old flea or whatever else we can be threatened by. And Mark mentioned before deformed wing virus, and if you look on the photo in the middle there, I think there is 2 bees with deformed wings. So there you go, that's what you're going to be looking at, all right, as a honeybee coming out with deformed wings. So next slide, please, Dave. So I decided to start breaking down this topic, all right. I really started thinking, okay, disease, we're concentrating on disease. So let's see, what is there? First though, I'm going to take these away. So these are things, these are non-infectious disorders of our bees. We can have chilled bees, overheating, we can have pesticide poisoning, queen problems, and, you know, those record keeping is going to help us observe those problems. But queen problems can be drone layers as well, or queens affected by viruses, which is a disease. So we can have starved brood and starved bees, and this picture here would probably be a classic example of not much food to keep our bees going at this time of year. So you really need to start looking at your frames just to make sure that they are going to be able to survive. They need food to generate heat, etc. So this colony would probably collapse in you know, a few weeks' time because there's just not the food there. And what's going to start happening is that cat brood will hopefully emerge. Maybe that brood has been covered enough by bees and they'll emerge, but they'll have no food. So anything the queen is laying, they probably will turn carnivore and start eating their eggs in starvation. So we don't want to have that kind of thing happening because the colony is going to collapse. Plant poisoning. There is plants in New Zealand that can affect our brood as well and our bees as well, but these are not diseases. These are disorders of a colony of a hive. So next slide, please. So diseases, can they be parasites, predators, scavengers of the honeybee? We're looking at Varroa, German wasps, wax moth, ants, cockroaches. They are all threats to our bees again, but they're not going to lead, well, they do lead to diseases. So again, I'm going to set that category aside as well. These are all threats to our bees, and they're all separate subjects again. And Dr. Mark Goodwin addressed our Varroa, and as he mentioned, Varroa can lead on to viruses. So and some of the other things that can lead on to viruses are the wax moth, as he mentioned as well, and ants, particularly the red ant. The red ant can bite our bees in defence, and through that bite it can spread things like sac brood. Cockroaches, you know, are they a problem? A personal thing, but these are parasites and things that are living or attacking our colony of bees. Next slide, please. So other things that we have to manage our hive for would be rats, mice, birds and livestock. Look at the bottom one, livestock, well, are they a threat? Well, they are. When they knock over our beehives, they're going to expose our colonies, so that's a threat. Birds can pick off dead bees, and if they're weak on the doorstep, they'll be taking them away as well. Mice and rats, well, they're going to affect our hive wear, and it's not a pretty sight afterwards. So again, not diseases, but will affect our colony. Next one, please, Dave. So now let's look at the cause of a disease. So I started reading up about this, and it was noted that a disease is an organism that is caused by, sorry, I can't read my notes now. And a disease is an organism that is caused by a pathogen, okay? So a pathogen is usually a microorganism, meaning you need a microscope to see this effect, to see this disease, or to see this pathogen, as we're now going to call it. So a pathogen can be a virus, a bacteria, a fungi, or a protozoa. But disease is also can be caused by these by other large organisms, such as mites. We just heard about the relationship between the virus sac brood and Varroa, and other insects such as moths, because they're going to expose things. So moving on to the next slide, now we're actually getting into diseases. And as Mark mentioned before, New Zealand, we do have viruses here. And I think I was pretty happy that I got the same number as Mark, in that we have 11 of the 17 viruses known. We did some bee pathogen research programs a little while ago, and I was quite surprised by some of the results, such as black queen cell virus being present in our hives. Now, some of these viruses we can see ourselves, such as the sac brood virus that Mark mentioned. We see these visual signs, and you can see a typical visual sign of sac brood underneath the capping, because this is when the sac brood virus actually kills the larvae pupae, going into that pre-pupae stage, it kills it then. And under the capping, you see this action taking effect, the black head of the larvae going into pupaing stage. And yes, it can have similar effects to American foulbrood. So one of these things being very visual for us, we need to make sure that we're identifying it as a sac brood virus and not as an AFB virus. So very important that you keep up your knowledge of what American foulbrood looks like, the visual signs of it, and you know, get second opinions or go to courses, go to refresh courses. They're all around Auckland, starting at the end of this month actually. So important to keep reminding yourself to know what the difference is. Deformed wing virus was another one that Mark just mentioned, but as you can see, there is some other ones that are happening. So these are viruses that are affecting our hive, or our colony of bees, I should say. So next slide, Mark. Oh, Mark, Dave. So there's a couple of things first I want to point out, and that's on the bottom right-hand side, is that these viruses can need a host, okay? So they can survive as an infection and outside of hosts for a number of years. So for instance, sapbrood virus can go for about 15 years, I think, just sitting in our cells waiting for a weak host to invade. And it can do this in a number of ways. It can do it by injury to the surface of the host. So that might be again from Varroa. It can also take hold on a host by bites from insects such as ants that I just mentioned, and that would be the red Argentine ant. Infected bodily fluid and contact with infected feces such as nosema. So nosema can be a problem in itself, and that's a whole topic which I'm sure Mark would enjoy talking about sometime in the future. So a virus, what can we do? Because this is how we can make our hives healthy and avoid these viruses taking effect. We need to know, firstly, that there's no known cures for viruses, but it's about management that's going to help you. So regular brood comb replacement, C-O-M, I spelled that wrong, comb replacement is a good idea. So Carol mentioned replacing brood area frames every now and again, and I strongly recommend that too. Regular replacement of queens if the queens are showing signs of virus effects. So in fact, she's not going to ever recover from that if she's affected by sapbrood virus, for instance, and you need to replace her, and then your colony can revive itself too. And the other one would be minimal nutritional stress, so providing food at all times, including when there's a deficiency of food. So checking that the levels of food are there throughout the whole year, even in winter. So managing colonies throughout the year is really important. Don't go on holiday for a couple of months in winter. So that hopefully helps with your viruses. And if we can move on to the next slide, thank you. So another thing that a disease is such a thing that can affect our bees would be a fungus. And some funguses are known as molds, and fungi can be found in every environment and play an important role in most ecosystems. But some funguses are parasitic on plants and animals and can cause disease. And that would be, for instance, for us in our bee colony is chalkbrood. And I find that chalkbrood, it can show signs in wet conditions, but also in very dry conditions. But for us, most of the time, it's going to be in those wet conditions. And I've seen over the years chalkbrood in our brood frames, usually in spring. You know, the hive colony might be sitting in a damp, cold, wet, mouldy environment. So this is where the chalkbrood can have an effect. And again, it's going to be on our larvae. So we need to be aware how healthy is the environment for our larvae to progress through the pupang stage. For us, signs, you've got to get in and look at that brood area. And you see like these white mummies, and you can see that sort of in that picture on the top right. Or you can actually see it on the doorstep. So the bees, they can quite often recover from it as we come out of the wet spring into a warmer summer. They will warm up themselves, and the colony, the hive wear will dry up as well. So those fungi basically goes back to spores. So you can see signs on the doorstep even where the bees are going to be throwing out the mummies, and you think it's old pollen, it's old white pollen, but it isn't, it's chalkbrood. So to help your bees again to provide result of avoiding this fungus developing and the spores sprouting, if you like. It would be to control the environment that they're living in, warmth, a dry condition, housing in winter and spring is really vital. Right, whatever. The other one is to remember that the fungus can actually survive for 11 years as a spore in a hive. So perhaps it's sometimes good advice to clean the actual box, the supers that the brood and the colony are living in. So not just replacing the frames, but actually cleaning the brood, the box themselves, and the floors and the lids. Really good idea. So next slide, please. Nosema, we have both these Nosemas here, and I'm actually going to avoid the subject because I'm hoping, I'm going to do a little bit of a hope here, wish that Mark can be a guest speaker in the future and tell us a lot more, because I know that Mark's done a lot of research on this subject, but we do need to be aware of it. For us, usually the visual signs is a lot of splat, if I'm right, on the front of the beehive. And to me, Nosema is like diarrhea for bees, so a pretty upset tummy. So I'm going to leave that one there, but this is another one that can be affected by conditions that the bees are living in. So we'll move on from that, and I'm hoping, Mark, have I done enough of a plug, Mark? I hope so. We're going to move on to the next one. Next slide. So the next slide is one that we're very aware of, and that's a bacteria. So bacteria is identified by the use of a microscope as well, but we do have a bacteria that we can visually see. So that would be American foul brood. Now, we quite often can't control the infection of American foul brood, though we as beekeepers are responsible for the spread of American foul brood. So a lot of the times it would be through our management of a beehive. So we need to be aware of that bacteria and that it can develop in our beehives. So best practice to avoid American foul brood within our own colonies is to put in place some quarantines, know the history of our brood frames, know the history of our honey frames even, and a bit of best practice and safety around how we are handling our gear would be the very basic ones I could think of. And again, you can pick up more ideas on that if you haven't already attended American foul brood recognition course. I strongly recommend it, or obtaining the book. That's going to really help you along that way. Again, this bacteria is a little bit out of our control, though we are responsible for it rather than the bees, and the bees can spread it within the colony itself once they have those that bacteria come into the hive. So next slide, please. So an overall conclusion of how can we prevent disease, it's going to be an action rather than a reaction. That's a preventative. So inspecting the hive, inspecting the whole brood area, you can see you need to do this to every frame of brood. Brood is going to show you a lot of what's going on. Observe the cappings in the brood, and if there is any question, get second opinions or Google and find out if this is a visual sign that you're seeing. Don't leave hives unmanaged. They pose a threat to the other colonies, especially if it's American foul brood, but your colony is eventually going to collapse by those things. And then it collapses, what do? You stock it away, and then you introduce a new swarm perhaps, or a new colony into that hive where is that a good thing? Perhaps not, because again, if it gets weakened by Varroa, those viruses are going to have that effect, because those viruses are still in that brood, in that frame of cells, or it's even in the hive where it's self. So I strongly recommend culling old frames before you put a new colony in, and doing some housework yourself and cleaning up of the floors and the supers and things like that. So I'm just going to go on to the next frame. Threats of disease can be different also from season to season. So you've got to remember to be proactive in winter particularly. This is when in autumn when our Varroa is having a high, is now got to a high level in the hive and viruses are starting to appear. Be really proactive, okay, really get in there first, get in quickly, and the response will be a quicker response than a long, slow one. It can take bees several months to recover from high numbers of Varroa, and those several months expose them to these other viruses. So move on, be prepared, get in early. That would be one of my things as a disease prevention and keeping a colony healthy. Last, I think, nearly, next slide, thanks. Identify risky situations. So helping the bees in their environment also. Where are they positioned? These can help avoid situations as well. Cold, wet, damp, even the angle of the beehive, especially at this time of year. Is the water going into the hive, sitting on the floor, creating mouldy situations? Wind has a huge effect on our colonies. In fact, it can have a bigger effect. Wind and cold can have a bigger effect than Varroa sometimes. So really be aware of those situations that you have to your hives in. And non-nectar flows are pretty important. If they are running out of food, don't forget starvation, don't forget those threats that can happen with that cold. They're not able to generate heat situations there. Nearly finished. Management prevention. Another one would be barriers. So you can see there's a little hive gate there, and those bees are able to protect that. That reduced my risk of wasps getting in there. It reduced my risk of robbing. And robbers, actually, when they come in and start stealing another colony's hive, guess what? They're actually hosting Varroa starting to come back into your hive as well, because the Varroa could be sitting on their backs from another beehive along the road. They come into your weak hive and hop off and then go into that brood. So even though you've treated for Varroa, you need to manage it to make sure you're not getting re-infestations. Reduce entrances are a really good idea at certain times of year, and of course they can backfire at other times of the year, so don't keep entrance reducers on all year round. Know when they are needed for their colony. And you can see on that right hand photo that there's moisture. So moisture, again, fungi growing. This time of year we've got our cold temperatures outside, that hits the tin roof, and then we have our colonies here which are generating heat. That warmth hits the cold and it turns into moisture. So what have you got as a barrier between there? I like to use my inner lid, but I have holes in the centre of them for certain reasons. And then I have some insulation, something to stop that cold that comes and hits from the tin and wet going into the colony. All right, so another prevention there. Next slide, please, Dave. Comb replacement. Wow, I took this one out of a box the other day. Give you a good example. I like to give examples of do what I say, not what I do. Anyway, this needs replacing. The colony was in a double brood box. They moved away from that bottom box. The molds and the funguses have got into the bottom of that frame. And I could have just taken that box off and stored it away in my shed and then put it back on in the spring and left the bees to clean that up. Is that really what we want? No, I'm going to scrape that all back. I'm going to water blast it. I'm going to give it a clean, coat it with wax again, and it will go back in. But I need to make sure that there is no scale signs of American foul brood. Otherwise, I'm just going to infect the colony. Now, the rest of the colony, I checked. The brood frames where the bees had actually moved to, I've checked. No visual signs, so that's all right. So storage of those frames, just be aware what you're doing it. Maybe those frames go back into the same colony. They don't go onto another colony. If I do, in my record keeping, I know where it went. So removing this is going to reduce the pathogen buildup, all right? The other thing to note is that it also, with these frames, these old frames, the cells are being reduced. And the other one is if I've got some very big, old, heavy frames, and that's because the wax has been built up on them over the years. And they actually, when they're full of honey, they weigh twice as much. So perhaps cleaning up those frames over this time of the year is a really good idea too. Next slide. So just a couple of typical ones here. Here's our cockroach. Is there a problem? Well, he's actually on the frame, and they leave feces behind as well. In the alpha lid, I don't care, but if they're on the frames, they're going to leave feces. So maybe our cockroach problem is there for a reason. The colony's too weak, and they're not shooing them away. There's that frame again with the molds. There's an old box. Really, it needs scrub, doesn't it? And the floor, if you can see the floor in the bottom right hand side, that's where the moisture has been able to accumulate and not very tidy. The bee's going to have to clean that up and get it all sealed up with propolis, and that's a bit of work for them. So let's avoid them being exposed to that and clean it up ourselves. And I think we're nearly on to the last slide, Dave. Hopefully. Oh, this is a really good example, isn't it? I deliberately kept the one. I can't remember where it came from, but I thought, you know, that's pretty crappy. And this is what can happen to plastic frames, all right? So, or even wooden frames. Luckily, wooden foundation frames, you're just going to cut all that out and clean it up and re-wax it. But this one's going to need a good scrub job. And, you know, look at all those funky fungi and molds and everything growing there. Let's move on to the next slide. Last one. So my recommendations is always to inspect all the brood comb. Know what's normal at the entrance of a colony as well throughout the season. Observe pollen and nectar, you know, make sure they're coming in, that there's enough food requirements. And it's quite interesting, odours and sight. So I have had beekeepers in the past open up a hive and they go, oh, it smells, oh, it must be AFB. It's not actually AFB, it could probably be, because the colony's being weak with Varroa, fungi are ahead of an effect in the hive. Things are damp, things are wet, poor bees, what a problem. So just make sure your odours aren't there as well, and sight is going to be a key thing. And good management is the conclusion. So thank you, that's it from me.
Okay, so we've got a bunch of questions here. There were a couple of polls that we put out there. We don't need to look at the first one around the Maggie James tutorial. We'll take that information and give that through to Carol. But this one here, I'll show the results of. I hope you guys can see that. So how often do you requeen? Most people were 2 yearly, 54% of you. 29% more than 2 yearly, and a few that do it multiple times a year. Mark, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Our recommendation is always to requeen every year, assuming you want the healthiest colony you can get at maximum production every year. And some of you will have to do it more than that because you'll put a new queen in and it won't survive, so you have to do it again. But trying to have a new queen every year is by far the best practice.
So my thoughts would be yearly if possible, because once a queen goes into her second season, she's likely to swarm.
Okay. What do you think, Carol?
Oh, every year as far as I'm concerned. Yes, I agree with Mark and come on that.
Okay. So in these questions, Tim Wilcox has got one here saying, I'm reading Thomas Seeley's The Lives of Bees and am interested on Mark's thoughts around hive proximity versus AIS, wild colonies spacing of hundreds of meters and their natural adaptation to Varroa in the context of hobbyists. That's quite a big question.
I'm not sure I understood the question, actually. Do you want to try that one again?
It says here he's reading a book from Thomas Seeley's The Life of Bees, and he's interested on your thoughts around hive proximity. He's got wild colonies spacing of hundreds of meters and their natural adaptation to Varroa.
Yeah, okay. For wild colonies, there's no natural spacing there. It's usually hard for them to find places or cavities to live in. So it's the distribution of the cavities that controls wild populations. For managed hives, we tend to put them all in one place. But if you do that, you get a lot of drift between colonies and disease spread. And if you have a whole line of colonies, the bees will drift between hives, but once they get to the end, they know where they are. And so you end up with the hives at the end having more bees than the ones in the middle. So you can do things like change the color of hives or put them in horseshoes, which will reduce drift.
Okay, cool. We've got a question here from Astrid asking Kim to show us your knitting, please.
That's my new hobby. I've learned, I have sheep now, and so I'm learning to spin and be very lifestyle block self-sufficient. So yeah, that's me, always knitting, always doing something.
Have you got anything there you can hold up? There we go, come on, show and tell, show and tell. On the spot.
Very bee related, but yes, this is a cardigan for me. All right, ta-da!
Okay, there you go, you've seen it. Next question. So, question from Karen. Has anyone created an algorithm to map Varroa numbers so we can anticipate how long it will take for regular treatments to bring numbers down? E.g., I'm treating hives with an average daily drop of up to 10 mites a day with oxalic acid vaporization weekly. The queen is still laying and cells still being capped and bees emerging. And I'm hoping to anticipate when I might pass the break-even point with the numbers of mites I'm killing off is higher than the number of mites emerging.
I'll have a go at that one. I don't know about algorithms. I've never been a great fan of measuring mite drop, although some people can make it really well, work really well. But the thing to do is to work out with your treatments whether the number of mites you kill each time is increasing or decreasing. If it's decreasing, you're obviously in the right way. If it's increasing still every time you use a treatment, then you obviously don't have it under control and you need to do something else.
Okay, do you guys, Carol or Kim, got anything to add to that?
No, I know nothing about it.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it, but I'd agree with Mark. And as I mentioned before, you can have re-infestation. So bees coming in and robbing from your colony, or your colony going and robbing from another colony, means you can get Varroa coming in again.
Okay, cool. We've got a couple of questions from Paul saying, how do you apply wax to a plastic frame after it's been water blasted? I'm assuming you let the thing dry and then you either paint it on with a brush or find a box that you've melted wax in, you can dip it. But you guys got any suggestions?
Yep, that's exactly like me. You've got to wait for it to dry. You are going to, even after water blasting, have some scale left in the cells. You're never going to 100% remove scale from the bottom of the cells. So the structure will change a bit, which means afterwards when they build out the frame from a plastic frame of that wax, it might seem to you a little bit deeper because they're having to still make that cell wall size, the size that they require. So just be aware, again, you need to make sure any frames that you are recycling is bacteria free, so that bacteria being American foulbrood.
Okay,
I can actually add to that. When painting plastic frames, especially if they're new, well, these ones aren't new, but make sure that they're aired for a while. A speed brush or a paint brush, and melt your wax in something like a electric fry pan on low. Dab the speed brush in, and then just put that over the frames, and that'll give you quite a nice covering. I found the speed brush is probably better to use than a paintbrush.
Yeah, you've got to have it at the right temperature, because as soon as it comes out of the wax, it's going to start hardening before you put it on your frame. So that action has to be very quick. Yeah.
We did have another question on that poll around queening. 67, the question was, would you requeen in spring or autumn? 67% of people said spring and 38% of people said autumn. Mark, do you want to start with what your thoughts are?
Yeah, it's always easiest to do it in the spring for a couple of reasons. You've got to, if you have to get rid of the old queen, she's much easier to find when there's not so many bees in your hive, and the bees are always more present in the spring. So requeening in the spring has all those advantages, but the problem is if you get it wrong and your colony's queenless, it's going to affect your honey production. You can do it in the autumn, and if you do it in the autumn, there's no risk of affecting your honey production, because if it goes wrong, you can probably fix it. But it's going to be harder. The bees are going to be aggressive, so it's a much harder thing to do. But what you don't want to do is do it late in the autumn, because if you do it late in the autumn and your queen fails, you may not be able to get another queen and requeen it before the winter, and the whole colony will die. So spring is the easiest, but you have to make sure it works. Autumn, but you do risk honey production. Autumn, it's harder to do, but you don't risk honey production from it.
Okay, Kim or Carol, you want to add to that?
I can.
Go on, Kim.
I can add to it a little bit. Yeah, there's disadvantages to both and advantages. Drones, if you're going to requeen with cells late autumn, you need to make sure you've got your drones still around. I always recommend never culling your old queen until you've seen your new queen is successful. So always, I always like to remove my old queen with a frame of brood, put her aside into a nuke box for that safety of a backup that she needs to go back in if there's been a problem. You know, you can combine her colony back again. So that just in autumn would save losing a queen completely. Yeah, there is, the honey flow is probably the big thing in spring. Yeah. But if you requeen in spring, you can also avoid a swarming too. Carol?
I prefer autumn for my requeening, mainly because of the weather conditions. I think in spring we've got a lot more rain and the weather is less stable for the queens to go out and mate, whereas in autumn I think we've got better weather, and if it's done at the right time you'll have enough drones. And as I say, hive records, I always note, you know, if there are drones in the hive. So I'm an autumn requeener.
Okay, cool. There's a question from Karen, another question from Karen saying, spring or autumn question mark, kill the existing one and make them raise their own from a queen cell from another hive, or buy a mated queen and follow the procedure. Now, I don't know if she's replying to another question or whether that's a question in itself. But does anyone have anything to say about that?
The best result is the more expensive one, of course, is to always requeen with a mated queen. But you have to remember that it's not always going to be successful, because it depends what the queen producer is doing. There's some very complicated things in there that can affect the success. Cells, of course, are only ever 80% effective. That you're always going to have to fix those up, because some of them they just won't get mated. But taking a frame out of one with brood on and put it in another is what we used to call a pauper split. it works, and the colony will raise a number of queen cells from that, and they'll requeen themselves. But what happens is the first one to hatch is the oldest larvae that they start to feed. So it's had royal jelly for the shortest period of time. So the queen you get from that is not as good as if you had done one of the methods.
Thumbs up from Kim. There's a question from, I think it's Char or Shah. What do you use to insulate under the lid of your hive?
Okay, so I'm pretty much a whatever is around. I've used plastic because that's not going to let any moisture through, and I've seen that in a few hives I've gone in and inspected. But otherwise, I've even used hessian, polystyrene, newspaper if it's needed, and I'm not anywhere in their home, and I've got apiary somewhere else. At the moment, I was able to find through a jumbo bin some wall insulation, wall, WALL insulation, and come to think of that, I might be able to use my sheep's wool. So yeah, it's really about getting a good layer in there. And if you look at a worry hives are great examples because they've got that big box of straw. And I love the old style feeders because it's the same thing. You put the old style feeder on and you put all that bracken and all that straw in and everything else. That's an insulator in itself. Any other ideas, you guys?
Well, there is the commercial polystyrene that you can put inside lids that bees can't chew out. I have used regular polystyrene that I'd cut to shape, and there was a small hole in the hive lid, and the person whose place was that the hive was at contacted me to say that there was fluff all over the garden, white fluff. So if you're going to use that, I would suggest the commercial polystyrene, and maybe we could ask Steve if he could buy a box, and you have to buy a box of I think a 50 or 100, which is quite a big buy, but maybe if the club actually bought a box, we could sell those to members. The bees don't chew them out, it's extra strong, and I've actually got it under half my hive lids. I've got to do a few more, but I think that that's a really, really good thing because it stays solid, and it's a good quality product.
I shall add that to my list for the shop, Carol.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, there's a couple more questions. Des has said he has 2 hives, both requeened in March with mated queens. Both were very placid after being requeened. Now one has gone aggressive. Any ideas? Can it be Varroa? I have been treating with oxalic acid, numbers gone high, so he's put in some Epistan treatments, wasps, question mark.
If it's got more aggressive, it's going to be the queen, almost always. And of course, when you requeen a colony, you're not going to find out how aggressive the workers are for 2 or 3 months afterwards, because to start off with, most of the workers there are from your old queen. So if it's changing over time, it's probably just that this queen's come from an aggressive stock, and slowly the old workers are dying and her new ones are taking over, and then you'll find out whether they are really aggressive or not.
Okay, any other comments about that, Carol or Kim?
No, not really. Mark, I'm just wondering, with the period of time you talk about, is it actually that long before you can actually tell whether the bees are aggressive or not? I thought the bees would have died off after, from that stock after, I guess it's 2 brood cycles, isn't it?
It depends.
Yeah.
It depends on when you do it. If you're doing it late spring, you get summer bees, which only live for 6 weeks. If you're doing it late autumn, you have, when you put your queen in, there's worker bees there that are winter bees that can live for 6 months, well, 5 months at least.
Right.
So,
thank you for clarification.
Okay, there is one other question here, which is from, oh, I can't even say the name, Jorg, I think, or Yorg. My hive collapsed due to Varroa last week. My question is, what is the best product that is friendly to bees and works best during winter in conjunction with oxalic acid vaporization?
I'll have a go at that one. I've never used oxalic acid vaporization, and I wouldn't use any method, it doesn't matter what it is, without checking to make sure it's worked. Because we've got what appears to be resistance to a number of the products out there, you need to treat, especially in the autumn, you need to treat early in the autumn, and you need to make sure that whatever you used has worked, because if it hasn't, you lose your hive, of course.
Yeah, I'd be in the same mind. Look, I've had that effect myself. I put some Varroa treatments in early and went back a month later thinking, yeah, she's right, and they weren't effective at all. So I rushed out, put a different type of Varroa treatment in, and you know, the colony survival was at risk because I delayed that monitoring for a month thinking she'd be right. So effect, and also some of those things like oxalic acid vaporizing, or even staples or whatever it is, you need to be doing that the correct way, the correct amounts, and the time frames that the product has been suggested to be used. Don't slacken off and miss one treatment or whatever because you were away that weekend. That can have an effect again. So the effect and the results are different for different type of chemical elements. Some are, you know, as low as 40-odd% results, and some of them are in their 70s, 80s. Gone is the 90% result rate. But yeah, it is those things that you need to manage and monitor.
And I'd probably make a comment about, you know, what exactly do you mean by bee friendly? Are you talking, you're obviously using oxalic now, are you actually wanting to use something that's in the organic line? So I mean, that would actually come into it. I mean, when you look at treatments, if you're wanting to keep it in the non-chemical range, you could use this in something like Thymol or something like that. That would actually work, but probably not in conjunction with oxalic acid. So you might use the Varroa Life or the other product that's available. So I think really that, I'm not really quite clear what your question is, but if you're asking about non-strip treatment, then probably that would be your option. You'd go to Thymol possibly.
Can I just add something in there? I was interested by the word bee friendly. Organics are not bee friendly.
No, they're not, Mark.
The problem with them is that the organic chemicals are only about 1 or 2 times more toxic to Varroa than they are to bees. So if you get the concentration wrong, you can either not kill the Varroa or you'll kill the bees as well. The one advantage with synthetics, although we see some resistance now, is they're thousands of times more toxic to Varroa than they are to bees. So mostly you can't harm bees with them.
Just touching on what you said around the I've forgotten the silly word, the mites getting resistance to the treatments. What sort of research is being done to try and combat that?
When Varroa first came into New Zealand, we had part of an answer. We didn't take the obvious next step, and that was to use a different chemical spring and autumn, so that if you got mites resistant to one of the treatments in the spring, hopefully the autumn treatment will kill them. What we didn't do, and what we should have done, is we should have had treatments that had more than 1 or 2 chemicals in the same treatment. So that it's what we do with other animal antibiotics we use, and with human antibiotics as well, we kind of have more. So it's much harder for Varroa to develop resistance. So we were halfway there with our alternated spring and autumn, but we never went completely the right way, which was have a multi-chemical approach.
Okay. There's one last question here from Suzanne saying she merged a weak and stronger hive after last season. She created an entrance for the top brood box, and now both have 2 entrances, and the bees are using both. Can I leave it like this, or should I remove the entrance to the top brood box and just keep the queen excluder between the 2?
I'm happy with using both, as long as you are checking the entrance down the bottom has got bees and brood area near it. So if the bees are coming in the bottom, but the brood is a lot closer up by the queen excluder, you know, that's not a really good situation, because pests and threats can still come down the bottom. So just be aware of where that actual brood and cluster colony is in the hive. You might have the 2 queens go through the whole winter and not see each other if there's a colony further down and a colony further up. So you could have a entrance, the colony brood, the honey wall, the queen excluder, and then you have your other brood colony above that and the honey above that. That's a fab situation to have. Anything less, just think of the threats that could get in there.
Yeah, if it was me, I would replace the queen excluder for a division board, so you've got 2 different colonies, or take the top colony and put it into a nuke box, because mostly that upper queen is going to have problems, because the bees will cluster around just one of the queens in one area of brood. Rather, if you have 2, they have to cluster over a much bigger area, and it's going to cause problems.
Yeah, that's that thermoregulating in the colony again. Don't forget the heat rises, so that heat will be rising up into that top colony, so the bees are more likely to move up there. So yeah, division board could be a really good thing. That way the bottom colony is still getting that heat generated in that bottom box, and the queen up the top is happy. Just make sure she's not getting blocked, she hasn't been blocked by honey. So where your honey is needs to feed both of them.
And if it was me, I would probably ask the question, why keep 2 queens? If one colony was it weak because of the queen or because of the queen laying pattern? Maybe have a look to see if one of those queens could be culled and take the queen excluder out and combine the colony, or put the best of the colony together once they're done, and give them 1 entrance.
Okay, cool. Last question. I think we're also about time for wrapping up, but another question from Karen saying, is anyone trialing both types of synthetic strips being added per treatment cycle, e.g. Apistan plus Apivar strips in the brood box for 8 weeks in the autumn treatment?
We asked that, we hunted around early on to ask that very question, and apparently Bayer has a patent on the idea, i.e. that you can't produce a product that does it. We asked them whether they were going to do it, and they said no, which wasn't particularly helpful. The one question thing you could do, and I say I could because we've never tried it, is, for instance, treat with fluvalinate and armatraz product at the same time, 1 strip of each. So if they're resistant to one, the other one should control it for you. But I have to say, we've never tried it. So if you are going to try it, you need to make sure that it provides sufficient control.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Oh, there's another question popped up. We can take that offline. This is how do we feed honey to bees? So I'm happy to respond to that outside of the webinar. Are you still around, Steve?
Yep, still here.
Okay, do you want to wrap it up?
Yep, sure thing. Thank you very much indeed for all three presentations and for the Q&A at the end as well. And thanks to those people who have come along and attended and dialed into today's webinar. We'll take the results of the poll about Maggie's tutoring session and have a look at that and arrange and let you know about that one. We'll also be letting you know about the AGM coming up, so we'll be sending out minutes and you know, last year's minutes and the finances for the club for the year and everything else like that in preparation for next month's meeting. But it's a nice day. So thank you very much for everybody for coming along, contributing, attending, asking questions and the like. And I'll look forward to seeing all members back at the club next July the 11th at next month's meeting. And we can, I can assure you the bees are being looked after very well by various committee members and so forth going in there. And so we're going into this winter hopefully in a much better position than we did last year. And I'm not expecting anything like the losses that we experienced last year. So in a good position there. Thank you. And we'll wrap up the webinar from there.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.